Hello and welcome to Ethical and Accountable Behaviour in Public Office. My name is David Gilchrist and this is a presentation that I made to the Parliament and staff of Western Australia on the 10th of August 2021. It's very much focused on a parliamentary environment, but I think a lot of the ideas and discussion points here are of a practical nature and would be relevant to public sector organisations and even to private sector organisations. In terms of the agenda for this presentation, really what I'm wanting to do is to be able to put some ideas together around the practical approach to ethical decision making, to frame ethics for better focus for those people that might be interested, and also to identify, the objectives of ethical decision and practice. That is, how you use ethical discussion and practice to be able to arrive at decisions that are appropriate in the context of your work or in the context of all those around you and are impacted by those decisions. I want to talk about the standard of ethical behaviour that's expected and some of the ideas around that, as well as to ask some key questions to give people some tools to be able to think through the ethical process themselves in the context of how they might approach decisions that they have to make in a parliamentary or public sector environment. To that extent, first and foremost, we really need to agree on what ethics are. And I don't propose to look deeply at the philosophy around ethics, which has been studied, as I'm sure all listeners would be aware, over thousands of years. But what I do want to do is, get us all on the same page in terms of what we think ethics are, in order to make sure that we're all thinking and talking about the same thing. To that extent, there's really two fundamental elements of ethics that we might be interested in. There is the ethics of personal behaviour and the ethics of conduct of an activity. In terms of the former, so the ethics of personal behaviour, that really relates to your personal beliefs, your expectations, your experience and the things that you hold dear as an individual. All of our ethical beliefs, our personal behaviours are probably slightly different, although many of us are on the same page about many different things. We all have differing views and differing intensities of those views in terms of what we think is important and what may not be important. On the other hand, conduct of an activity is relating to organisational and professional expectations in ethics, that is, professional ethics. Conduct of an activity relates to the body corporate or the group, how an institution might operate. And so to that extent, really it is the conduct of an activity and ethics around that we're interested in today. A parliament, a public sector organisation, or even a private sector organisation or institutions that are looking to drive ethical decision making to various degrees and for various purposes. But the idea here is to look at the conduct of activity and how we might moderate our ethical decision making in order to achieve the outcome that is needed and identified by that particular institution. So what are the areas of concern here? Certainly IT and communications is a great area of concern for anyone involved in any public undertaking. Communications particularly are fast and furious with social media and other things that might impact the way you actually relate to those people that you are concerned to communicate with. And being so fast, being so quick to get off the mark can mean that you lay yourself open to ethical considerations. So thinking about IT and communications is a critical aspect. Thinking about financial operations and entitlements is also a critical aspect, particularly in a parliamentary situation or in the public sector where there are expectations that people use public funds as effectively as they can and as sparingly as they can. Notwithstanding, there are decisions that need to be made in terms of claiming entitlements or making decisions around what kinds of financial operations you might undertake. Considering the ethical factor in this area is absolutely critical. Social behaviour and interaction is also a really important issue. Members, staff, public, interacting with everybody that you come across in the context of the institution is a critical aspect of ethical consideration. So too is the work approach and professionalism, making sure that you're working in a professional way and that you understand what the ethical framework looks like and how that ethical framework might apply to you in your day-to-day work. There's two aspects to ethical behaviour that's really important to consider as well. One is actually being ethical, that is, that behaving in a way that is actually ethical. The second, and perhaps just as important element, relates to apparent ethical behaviour. That is, that those people that you're working with, those people in the general public, in the case of members of parliament or those in the public sector, those in corporations, need to not only actually act ethically, but they also need to give the appearance or be apparently ethical. And there can be disparages between these two things, where someone can be acting ethically but appear to be unethical. And that becomes a really difficult communication issue that many people have to deal with. And no doubt members of parliament are no strangers to this incongruity. So what's the objective in terms of ethics themselves and ethical decision making? There's a number of objectives that are really important in the context of that institutional perspective that I talked about before. So again, we're looking at the institution and looking at individual behaviours and ethical activities in the context of maintaining that institutional legitimacy. So in terms of objectives here, certainly ethics and discussion around ethics is intended to guide behaviour. It's intended to ensure equity and uniformity. That is, that everyone gets, if you like, the same thing or has the same outcome in relation to a particular issue or query. It's also intended to ensure predictability, and this is really important in an institutional setting where different players, different actors are expecting different outcomes in relation to ethical decision making. They need to be able to predict what that outcome will be and to be able to plan accordingly. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, of course, that acting ethically helps to maintain the legitimacy in an institution. An institution like a parliament or a public sector agency really relies on that legitimacy in order to be able to have assumed authority in the community, but also to be seen to be doing the right thing in relation to things like public funding and professional behaviour. I guess the key issue here is that in terms of maintaining legitimacy in the institution, it really only takes one or two people to act unethically or to be seen to be acting unethically to diminish that legitimacy for all people in that institution. And so an institution and its legitimacy is only as strong as the weakest link. At the end of the day then, professional ethics underpin corporate culture and also drive corporate culture. And I think this is a really important consideration. Ethics and corporate culture are indivisible and they impact and influence each other. So what is the standard expected? This is a really difficult question because it can relate and be variant depending on the issue at hand. It can be variant depending on the particular background of the individual and how they feel about particular things, which is why we're really keen to look at the institutional standard rather than the individual standard. In other words, when I'm talking about the standard expected here, I'm not talking about what I might expect of myself, but I'm talking about what others in the institution would expect of me. To that extent, particularly in the public sector, in parliaments and for members of parliaments, there's no doubt that the standard expected in ethics is higher than that for private citizens. There's also no doubt that it's arguably higher than that required of professions. So particularly members of parliament who are representing their constituents, but also using public funds and public capacity in order to execute their political and other objectives. The idea of the public interest is also a really important consideration, and particularly from ethical decision-making perspective, making sure that all the decisions we make are as far as possible aligned with the public interest and taking into account what might be the public interest in the context of that particular decision. There is also another thing that's important in the context of ethical decision-making in parliaments and public sector agencies, and that is the issue of qualitative materiality. Qualitative materiality relates to not the size of an issue that's being dealt with, say in terms of dollars, but rather in terms of what that issue represents or what kind of expectations might arrive as a result of seeing people undertake particular decisions or to behave in particular ways. In other words, an amount of money might be allocated to a Member of Parliament. It might be a small amount of money, and in any other circumstances might be considered to be immaterial. However, in the public sector or in the parliamentary environment, that would be a material element, not because of the size of the amount of money, but because of what the behaviour suggests in relation to the way that person operates, thus potentially reducing the institution's legitimacy. So fundamentally, there are higher expectations resulting from compulsory citizen engagement. And I think this is a really important expectation or consideration. That is that all of us in, say, Western Australia, in Australia, we are all subject to parliaments and subject to law. We can't opt out of that. We can't choose not to participate. And so because that compulsory citizen engagement or compulsory citizenship, if you like, has an impact in terms of what those decisions mean for individuals, everyone has a higher than expected, a higher standard of ethics expected of them as compared to, say, private citizens. The other thing that individual members of Parliament and others need to consider is the fact that while some of the expectations in terms of ethics may grate because of your private beliefs or personal considerations, that can be very frustrating, but it's not an excuse in terms of not meeting the ethical standard. And I think this is a really critical issue for those involved in public sector organisations. At the end of the day, it can be frustrating to have standards applied to you in an institutional setting, but not meeting those standards is not acceptable. In other words, that frustration does not lead to an excuse for not doing what you need to or should do. So I guess applying ethics. When we think about applying ethics, we are thinking about how we apply those ethics in the context of decision making. And I think sound ethical decision making is dependent on a few things. First and foremost, it's critical that the person making the decision has a knowledge of the basic principles on which moral values and rules are based. Importantly, rules versus principles is a really important consideration because at the end of the day, our system relies on a principles-based approach rather than a rules-based approach. That is that when we're thinking about ethics and thinking ethically, we shouldn't be thinking about how we can get away with something or how we can make something fit in terms of the rules, but rather we should be considering the principle at hand and what is intended in relation to the way those rules are put together, what kind of behaviour is intended to be prevented or promoted. And we should work to those principles regardless of whether we think we can, so to speak, get around the rules. We also need to have competence in decision-making skills in order to undertake sound ethical decision-making. Competent decision-making skills means that we can actually enunciate, step out the problem, identify the key elements of the problem, and work out also what the alternatives might be and what the outcomes of those alternatives would be if you made the decision that way. In other words, you need to have a way to be able to competently set out the problem and make a decision in that context. You also need to have the ability to choose appropriate policies and decision procedures in different situations. And I think that goes hand in hand with the principles idea that was talked about a couple of minutes ago, where we have to have the ability to ensure that we are applying the right rules and the right context to the problem that we have. At the end of the day, I guess that goes hand in hand with competence in decision-making skills as well. In other words, how do we make sure that our decision-making skills are such that we can identify not only the problem, but what the potential solutions to that problem might be? And then, of course, in a parliamentary situation, arguably the reasonable person test does not apply. So what a person might think in the street about a particular issue and the relative merits of the ethical side relating to it, at the end of the day, really the reasonable person test is probably not applicable in a parliamentary situation, because a reasonable person doesn't find themselves in that really peculiar position of having such a significant exposure to and responsibility to the population as compared to being responsible to themselves. At the end of the day, I think the reasonable person test is perhaps a consideration, but I don't think it's an acceptable level in the context of particularly the principles surrounding ethical decision making that we talked about before. One element that might be of value here is a code of ethics. Codes of ethics are intended to provide formal, systematic statements of rules, principles, regulations, or laws. They're intended to set out what's expected and perhaps even set out how you might approach ethical decision making in that context for your institution. The thing about codes of ethics is that they also set out what the punishment might be in relation to undermining behaviour. I guess when we look at codes of ethics, though, we really need to think about them in the context of that principles argument I made before. So while the codes of ethics seek to set down in black and white all of these ideas surrounding ethics in a particular institution, it can't deal with everything, and it certainly cannot, other than articulate the principles, help you to define and refine your decision making in the context of those principles. However, a code can do a few things. It certainly makes explicit the values required. It might indicate how members should act in certain situations, and sometimes codes have examples and exemplars so that you can look at those examples and act accordingly. It provides a decision-making framework, so not only does it set out all of the principles, it says this is how you might approach your decision-making in the context of an ethical issue or even a broader issue. And it provides an objective basis for sanctions. In other words, it sets out what happens if you get it wrong. So what about ethical decision making then from a practical perspective? Well, I guess there's the public interest test as a really important consideration. Is what I want to do or what I'm thinking, or is one of the options in the best interests of the public? In other words, does it meet the requirements of the public? Does it advance the interests of the public at large? That's the actual ethical requirement. So achieving that public interest test and answering the question in that context is absolutely critical. On the other hand, we're all used to thinking about the pub test, which is the apparent ethical requirement. And you'll recall earlier in the presentation, I talked about this idea of actual ethical requirements and a requirement to be apparently ethical, that is seen to be ethical. And I think these two tests go hand in hand. The public interest test, well, is what I'm suggesting going to be in the best interests of the general public? And what would it look like in a pub if I spoke to somebody? How would they react to what I've done or what I'm proposing to do? Of course, there's a number of personal tests as well, and these largely constituted by questions that you might ask yourself as you're going through that process. First of all, there's the self-interest test. This question that I'm looking to answer, is it a difficult or an ethical issue because I actually stand to gain by one of the options that might be provided there? The self-interest test doesn't mean that every time there's something that is in your interest, you shouldn't make a decision accordingly, because things like claiming allowances and so on obviously have a self-interest element, but claiming allowances is appropriate generally and should be pursued by members of Parliament, because that's the resources are required in order to do your job. All I'm saying here is that the personal test is, well, just think about that self-interest test and think about how that self-interest that exists might be colouring the way you're approaching that particular decision making. The other tests are really phrases that often help, I guess, settle our minds and consider our question from a different perspective. For instance, after the heat of battle test is a really important test. What does that mean? It means that when I come back to this, not being under pressure, perhaps thinking more clearly or having more time to approach this question, would I answer the question the same way as I'm suggesting I should answer it now? A similar test might be in relation to if I have to ask. So that if I have to ask if this is ethical, if this is an appropriate action, if I'm making the decision appropriately, then perhaps that is also a major test in itself. If I'm unsure, perhaps that's indicative of a poor ethical outcome if I go a particular way. Again, not always, but it relates to asking the question to make sure you're settled in your mind how you might move forward. Would I expect others test is also a consideration here. So in other words, I'm doing it. Would I be happy if others did whatever it is that I'm wanting to do? Would I be comfortable if I thought others were doing this particular thing? Does it make sense in the context of thinking about somebody else doing it or deciding that way as opposed to me doing it or deciding that way? The further test, and all of these are quite similar as I'm sure you're identifying here, but the explaining to the judge test is often used in professional circles where you think about what you might say some considerable period of time down the track when the dust has settled and when you have had time to contemplate what you're doing, but more importantly perhaps explaining your ethical decision outcome to somebody that might not have an interest or even be involved in the decision-making process is a really interesting thought to put on your head in order to be able to articulate whether or not you think this makes ethical sense from your perspective. And I guess most appropriately in the context of parliaments, perhaps the if I were in opposition test is a useful test as well. In other words, if I noticed somebody in government doing this when I was on the opposition benches, would I be comfortable in raising this as an issue, or would I think that this is fine and appropriate? In other words, how would I react if I was observing someone on the opposite side of the house undertaking an ethical decision in the way that I'm proposing to undertake that decision? In a sense, all of these are versions of the front page of the West Australian test. In other words, if we saw this on the front page of the West Australian, would we be comfortable or would we be uncomfortable in terms of explaining the outcome that we've arrived at in the context of this ethical decision-making process? That's all I wanted to cover today, to give you some ideas and some general comments around how you might approach ethical decision making. I'm delighted to be contacted if you think that would be useful, and if you've got any questions or comments, please let me know and I'd be very happy to respond. All the best.